Hello, I am Michael Avedon at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm going to be talking about clinical decision making, aided and abetted by the EEG. Before starting, I want to acknowledge the various funding agencies that are generously supporting some of the research that I am doing, and also to declare that I have no financial conflicts of interest. The outline for this talk is going to be the following 4 areas. I'm going to do some brief revision and then go on to some clinical decision, first more in depth and then rapid fire, and then finally some vignettes that I think are worth mentioning. So let's start with revision. First, I want to refresh your memory about the waveforms, the nomenclature for the waveforms that make up the electroencephalogram. And I remember it by the mnemonic get battered, from gamma through beta, then alpha, theta, and then delta. Importantly, in terms of general anesthesia, the gamma waves are typically not well perceived because they're attenuated by the skull. However, with electrocorticography, you can see gamma waves into hundreds of hertz. Beta waves are very important in terms of general anesthesia and sleep, because when we're awake, we typically have high beta frequencies in the 20 to 30 hertz, and the first thing that tends to happen with sedation is a shift to low beta frequencies. And then when we are asleep, classical sleep spindles are often in the 12 to 14 hertz range, and those are often referred to as sigma waves. Then spindles during sleep and during anesthesia can go into the range of alpha and theta waves. Alpha waves are classically between 8 and 12 hertz. These are also referred to as mu waves when over the sensory motor cortex. Theta waves between 4 and 8 hertz, and then delta waves between 0 and 4 hertz, and often these are subdivided into slow delta waves, which are less than 1 hertz. This is an example of a spectrogram. I have taken this image from the website anesthesia-EEG.com, which has been put together by Emery Brown and Patrick Purdon, and is a very useful educational resource for EEG. And this is essentially a 3-dimensional graphic transformation, which includes time, decomposing the EEG into its spectral components. So on the y-axis, you have frequencies of the EEG going from delta through theta, alpha, beta, then low beta, high beta, hereabouts you have sigma, and then above 30 hertz you have gamma waves. So you can see I've labeled them over there. And this is time, and this is a typical general anesthetic with induction, with propofol. So prior to induction, you've got a lot of these delta waves, but you also have waves throughout the spectrum. You've got high proportion of gamma, but also high frequency beta waves. And then as anesthesia is induced, you get a loss of these higher frequency waves right up there. You get the prominence of these delta waves. And then as you switch to maintenance anesthesia, you get this delta spindle pattern to which we've referred so often. And here there are both low beta and high alpha components. So sigma spindles and alpha spindles, there isn't really the same density of theta waves. And then here you have delta waves, and this is with emergence from anesthesia, your loss of your spindles, decrease in the delta density, and then the reappearance of your high frequency waves. So with a volatile anesthetic agent, which is really mostly what I've been focusing on, and most of today's examples will be based on volatile anesthetics, you can really see these various stages of anesthesia going all the way down from awake, where you can see blinks and a lot of EMG activity, muscle activity, and then as you become relaxed, you lose some of the muscle activity. You still have the high beta frequencies, and then as you transition to light general anesthesia, you transition to low beta, maybe sigma waves, and then some alpha spindles, but typically not with a robust slow delta pattern. And then with adequate general anesthesia, the volatile anesthetic, we like to see a slow delta wave pattern, which can be referred to, Jamie Slay and colleagues refer to that as slow wave anesthesia. But also there can be superimposed spindles or dominant delta activity with excessive anesthesia. Excessive anesthesia could already be occurring in this delta dominant zone, especially with a lower frequency of the spindles, so theta spindles or even low frequency alpha spindles. But certainly once you get to patterns of burst suppression and persistent suppression, anesthesia is probably excessive. So let's look at an example. This is a single frontal EEG channel with 4 different sweep speeds. The sweep speeds are reflected over here. At this fastest sweep speed, you can actually count the spindles: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you've got 9 Hertz alpha spindles over there, and these are cross-frequency phase amplitude coupled with these lovely delta waves. And these delta waves are, if you see over there, at approximately, you've got 1, 2, 3 of them in just over 2 seconds. So approximately 1 Hertz, maybe a bit faster than that. But also important to note here is that these spindles are more prominent on the crest rather than on the trough of the slow delta waves, and this might also be consistent with slightly deeper general anesthesia. The presence of theta spindles is more common with volatile-based general anesthesia than it is with propofol-based general anesthesia, so that is something that you should look out for, and maybe some of the examples will show that. As anesthesia deepens, the frequency of the spindles tends to shift from the higher frequencies, the sigma spindles, through the alpha, even down to theta spindles, and you tend to get more dominance of delta waves. With propofol anesthesia, the delta waves can be very high amplitude indeed, possibly higher than classically seen with volatile-based general anesthesia. So this is a figure taken from an article by Lee and others, including Jamie Slay from the British Journal of Anesthesia. And what I want to point out is that as isoflurane concentration increases, which you can see on this axis over there, these are the frequencies. First of all is that the amplitude, the power, if you like, of the delta waves increases with the increasing concentration of isoflurane, and the frequency of the spindles tends to shift from higher to lower frequencies. So here we're dealing with sigma or alpha spindles, and as the isoflurane concentration increases, it goes down to theta spindles, and then you get a much more delta dominant pattern with less of the spindles being present. The neurophysiology of spindles and delta waves is important to reinforce. The spindles result from repetitive spike bursts in thalamic reticular neurons that produce rhythmic inhibitory postsynaptic potentials in thalamocortical neurons. So you've got this constant inhibition in thalamocortical circuits that often prevents transmission and integration of information in the cortex. The delta oscillations can be locally generated in the cortex, but they can also be generated in reticular neurons associated with the thalamus and in thalamic cells as well. And these delta oscillations are typically incoherent across the cortex, so you might get delta waves all across the cortex, but they tend not to be synchronized over within time. So if you looked at a delta wave here and a delta wave there, they wouldn't necessarily be in phase, and that might also reflect an inability to integrate information across the cortex, although these are somewhat hypothetical when we look at the EEG and try to understand what the underlying neurobiology could be. It is often thought that the thalamus is a gate through which information passes, and that when thalamocortical neurons are hyperpolarized, transfer of information to the cortex and from the cortex back to the cortex is curtailed. So if the thalamus is an important relay station, when its cells are hyperpolarized, you can imagine how that could lead to information transfer being prevented and possibly also consciousness being impaired. And that might be a key feature of general anesthesia. And the extent to which general anesthesia is a top-down or a bottom-up process is, I guess, somewhat controversial. So let's go on to some examples of clinical decision-making. And, I think I might just change the pen color so that it's easier to see, because this one is really not being great. So let's try a green pen and see if that's better for you. Okay, so let's take this typical patient having surgery with typical medications, vascular surgery, and these are the anesthetic medications that this person has received, and they are receiving an ether-derived volatile anesthetic agent at about 0.7 Mac. So please look at these options, and I'm going to show you the EEG for this patient, and consider which of these apply to this particular patient, both in relation to the slow waves and to the spindles. So here is the EEG to which I referred. As I mentioned, the age-adjusted MAC is 0.7, and then here is a single frontal EEG channel. The scale is 100 microvolts, and this is going from the fastest sweep speed to the slowest. So actually this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds, and then this would be 12 seconds, this would be 24 seconds, and this would be 48 seconds. The sweep speed going down to 6.25 millimeters per second, and the sweep speed here is 50 millimeters per second. So if you look here, you can actually see the spindles, and you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have 10 hertz. So these are alpha spindles. The spectral edge frequency is 12.7. So the computer algorithm is suggesting that 95% of the frequencies are less than 12.7 hertz. And we're seeing that the spindles appear to be at about 10 hertz, so that's consistent. You can really see these beautiful big delta waves. This is a nice place where they're appreciated. Over there to over there. So remember, I said this is 1 second, this is 2 seconds, this is 4 seconds. So if you have 2 and 4 seconds, it's a frequency of half a hertz. So we've got half a hertz delta waves and alpha spindles at about 10 hertz. This to me looks like very consistent with adequate general anesthesia. This BIS number seems nonsensical for what I'm seeing on the EEG and the clinical context. The spectral edge frequency is consistent with the EEG. So basically the BIS is wrong in terms of what it should be indicating, and I can't see any good explanation for this artificially elevated BIS value. So the relationship between the BIS and the EEG is concordant or discordant. I think I've kind of given you a clue to that, and you can probably ascertain that it's discordant. So based on the data available, which of these would you do? So I think that it's fair to say that, again, I've given you enough information to say that you don't necessarily need to make any change. So let's look. This is the same EEG, but blown up and analyzed. So there then are the slow delta waves with the alpha spindles at 10 Hertz, phase amplitude coupled with those slow delta waves, and this is consistent with adequate general anesthesia. So the predominant features, just to recap, are alpha waves at 10 Hertz and delta waves at half a Hertz. The relationship is discordant and no change is needed. So let's look at an example of actually using the EEG based on the principles that I've summarized to titrate volatile-based general anesthetic. So here's an example of an EEG at two different sweep speeds. This is a very slow sweep speed where we can see these nice delta waves, and a faster sweep speed where the spindles are apparent. And I've annotated this for you. So let's look at some of these features. These big delta waves, we're at 100 microvolts in scale. The high amplitude delta wave is at about half a Hertz. This is 8 seconds, so we'd have about 4 of these in 8 seconds. It's relatively high scale, so the power of the EEG is relatively high. You can count the spindles in this faster sweep speed, and you can see that in 1 second we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 peaks. So we have those consistent with theta waves. So already you're getting the picture that this is relatively deep general anesthesia. This is concordant with a BIS value of 31, a spectral edge frequency of 7.7 Hertz, which is reassuringly congruent with our actual count of the spindles. And the volatile anesthetic agent is actually at 1.2 age-adjusted Mach. So with this pattern, it would be reasonable to decrease the general anesthetic. So now we go to time 2. This is a screenshot from a program called AlertWatch, which we use in our operating theaters. You can look at it online. It's a very nice decision support platform. And then at time 2, we decreased the age-adjusted Mach to approximately 0.85. The BIS increased. It was in the 30s. It's now gone up to the 40s. But let's look at the EEG. How did the EEG change? So important changes in the EEG. This is the same person at time 2. And what I want to point out is the scale now is 50 microvolts. I think it was 100 before. So some of our waves are going off scale here, but that is allowing us to appreciate the spindles better. So you can still see these delta waves. Delta waves, here's a good example of a delta wave, then another example of a delta wave, and then delta waves down here as well. So lots of slow delta waves are present. Here is another delta wave that I drew, which is at about 1 Hertz. I think the delta waves are between 1.5 Hertz. And then at this faster sweep speed, now you can see that whereas before we had theta waves, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we have alpha waves at 9 Hertz. So clearly the EEG has changed with the phase amplitude coupling of the alpha waves to delta waves at a bit less than 1 Hertz. So still consistent with general anesthesia. The BIS, which is 44, and the spectral edge frequency, which has gone up to 9.9, is consistent with our findings and with our interpretations here. The volatile anesthetic concentration is now 0.8 or 0.85 age-adjusted Mach. And I would say now that anesthetic depth appears relatively appropriate based on the data that we have. At time 3, we've gone down further on the anesthetic concentration to 0.7. So let's see what's changed now. So now you can count alpha spindles, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Hertz. So they've gone up a bit to 10 Hertz. The spectral edge frequency is roughly 10 Hertz. The BIS has gone up to roughly 47. You can still see pretty prominent delta waves throughout. There are many delta waves. So now you have alpha waves, which are phase amplitude coupled to these delta waves at about 0.5 Hertz. And again, this is consistent with general anesthesia. The patient had some movement, but this is unlikely to reflect awareness or wakefulness because this pattern is very much consistent with somebody being unconscious. I'll talk a bit later about differences between sleep and general anesthesia. The differences are nuanced, especially when you're not dealing with burst suppression or persistent suppression, which doesn't occur during physiological sleep. But some of the features, the persistence of the spindles is more consistent with general anesthesia. The delta waves can be a bit more erratic with general anesthesia. And the slower spindles are also more common with general anesthesia than with physiological sleep. With physiological sleep, you tend to get more of the sigma spindles and maybe the higher frequency alpha spindles. Certainly theta spindles and lower frequency alpha spindles are less usual with physiological sleep. But I have to say that it can be very tricky to distinguish sleep from general anesthesia, absent things like burst suppression and persistent suppression, and it takes a lot of finesse and experience to appreciate those differences. So let's move on to Hans's clinical decisions. This is Hans Berger, one of the pioneers of electroencephalography. But you might have heard from one of my previous lectures that I have some reservations about Hans Berger, because he was involved in a body called the Erbgesundheitsgericht, which is the hereditary health court, or was the hereditary health court. It's a bit of an Orwellian term, hereditary health court, because that hereditary health court used to sentence people to death based on genetic abnormalities or disabilities, and he was one of the arbiters in that court. So I'm not a big fan. This is one of the propaganda posters related to this hereditary health court, where it was saying that Germans' taxpayer dollars went to paying for the support of people with disabilities, and that wasn't a good usage of money. So although I really should be doing Hans's clinical decisions, I am choosing instead to use somebody whom I prefer, and that person is Albert Einstein, who has actually got very little to do with electroencephalography, but nonetheless, let us proceed with Albert's clinical decisions. So, here's the first example. Based on this very limited information that I'm giving you, would you say anesthesia is too deep, adequate, or insufficient? So that's pretty tricky because I haven't given you sweep speeds. If you don't actually know what scale we're dealing with, actually you can see the scale here is 50 microvolts. But what are the sweep speeds? I'm going to tell you the sweep speed here is 50 millimeters per second, and the sweep speed here, so that's 4 seconds of data, and the sweep speed here is 6.25 millimeters per second, so this is an epoch of 32 seconds of EEG. But let's put in some of the details for you. So this is 1 of 4 seconds, and this is 8 of 32 seconds. Now you can actually count the spindles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So we're roughly at 14 hertz, which are sigma spindles, and we have a lot of slow delta waves visible over there in this slower trace. So we have sigma spindles, phase amplitude coupled with slow delta waves, which are at about 1 hertz. Depending on other information, this could be adequate general anesthesia, or it could be slightly on the low side with the spindles at about 14 hertz. So I think we would need more information to make a determination. So consistent with adequate general anesthesia, but more information would be helpful. And then also to mention, as I said previously, is that given that these are sigma spindles, although they are persistent, the delta waves are a little bit, they're a bit erratic, so again, more consistent with general anesthesia. However, you couldn't be sure that this wasn't just reflective of natural sleep. All right, let's have a look at this one. So this is a 63-year-old who's undergoing abdominal surgery. So would you change sevoflurane administration? The BIS is looking ominously high at 56, and we're at only 0.68 adjusted MAC. So, well, what do you think? And by the way, you should pause the video whenever you like to try to reflect on and answer these questions. So let's look at some of this information in more detail. So I've broken down the EEG with the fastest and the slowest sweep speed. Now you can count the spindles, and you can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have 10 Hertz here on our alpha spindles. And you can see a lot of delta waves here. This is beautiful delta activity. So nice to see the underlying delta waves. Okay, so actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 delta waves in 8 seconds. So less than 1 Hertz there on the delta wave. So alpha spindles at 10 Hertz. And the delta waves lined up pretty well with what I had estimated, although the other estimate was also my estimate. So delta waves at less than 1 Hertz. The spectral edge frequency is missing from these data over here, but I would estimate that it's about 11 Hertz or so. So that's why I estimated it 11. We're at 0.6 age-adjusted Mach. Everything else looked good, our clinical context. So I would say that regardless of this high BIS number, this is consistent with adequate general anesthesia. What I've outlined here is the EMG of 42. The BIS is very affected by muscle activity or by muscle artifact. I think there's some muscle artifact here which is artificially raising the BIS value. So that probably accounts for this unexpectedly high BIS value. So taking all these data together, I would put to you that that anesthesia is adequate and no change is needed. We can safely proceed as we are. How about this example? So here is the information at our disposal. We're at 0.8 Mach, and here the BIS is reading 65. Golly gosh, what shall we do? Now the spectral edge frequency is also on the high side at 16.4. So we could say, let's crank up the volatile, but rather than doing that, let's examine the EEG waveforms ourselves. So let's count the spindles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12 Hertz. So we're kind of at the upper end of the alpha range, heading into sigma territory. I can see some delta waves there, but maybe not the most prominent delta pattern that you could wish for. So, maybe anesthesia is slightly on the light side. I think it's certainly consistent with general anesthesia, but something we could keep an eye on. So there are our spindles. That's a slow delta wave at about 0.5 to 1 Hertz, and possibly consistent with adequate general anesthesia, yes, but worth keeping an eye on it. I don't think that the BIS value of 65 is correct. All right, how about this one? Here you have, again, age-adjusted Mach of 0.8, high BIS of 57, and a spectral edge of 13. So based on this information, do we think that anesthesia is adequate, insufficient, or too deep? So here we have spindles at 13 Hertz, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 Hertz. So even when I count it after the fact, it's consistent. Now you'll ask why I didn't count this in a spindle, and this is a question I'm going to ask you. There are also really very consistently these large delta waves that are present, which I think are quite unmistakable, and they're at about half a Hertz. So I think that this is entirely consistent with adequate general anesthesia, despite the BIS of 57. I think no change in, depending on the clinical context. I'm always going to say depending on the clinical context, but no change is indicated here. And the artifact that's present is ECG artifact. So these here are also ECG artifacts present in the EEG, and I think I might show that better subsequently in relation to the ECG. All right, here's another example for you. Again, a BIS of 65, a high spectral edge, and now we're at 1.1 Mach, so pretty generous MAC. So based on this information, is anesthesia too deep, adequate, or insufficient? So here you can see that the spindles are at 15 Hertz. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 Hertz. So 15 Hertz on our spindles, which is consistent with the spectral edge frequency of 16.4. There are delta waves here, maybe not as prominent as in some of the previous examples. So we have sigma spindles, we have delta waves. I think the one thing that is reassuring here is the MAC value. So on that basis, I might keep an eye, but this is potentially concerning for slightly light general anesthesia just based on EEG criteria. So probably adequate, but maybe on the lighter side. If this was at 0.6 or 0.7 MAC, I would definitely dial up the vaporizer, but at 1.1, assuming that it is steady state and that is an end tidal concentration, I might keep an eye and see how things go. Alright, here's another example where we're at 1.3 MAC. Our BIS is fairly low at 41 and our spectral edge is at 12. Okay, so if we look here, this is a 6-second epoch and a 48-second epoch with the fast and the slow sweep speed. I think you can count the spindles here at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 11 Hertz, consistent with our spectral edge frequency. And you can also see that there are these slow delta waves at less than 1 Hertz. A lot of examples of these slow delta waves. So spindles at 11 Hertz as we counted, and delta waves are present and more obvious. Actually, this is the same example, this is the same patient as here, but at a higher MAC concentration, and the spindles and the delta waves, the spindles have slowed down and the delta waves have become more prominent. So anesthesia is probably adequate and deeper than it was previously. I don't necessarily think I could argue based on EEG criteria alone that it's on the deeper side, but the 1.3 MAC is certainly suggestive. Okay, how about this example? This is somebody who is at 0.9 MAC, hemodynamically maybe on the slightly lower side, especially with the heart rate. So here we're going a little bit off scale. We're probably still at 50 microvolts per millimeter. Well, sorry, it's not per millimeter. The scale is probably more like 7.5 microvolts per millimeter, but the scale of the BIS isn't given as per millimeter. It's just given as the scale for the entire EEG. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 7 Hertz over there. So actually theta wave territory, very nice prominent big delta waves there, probably less than 1 Hertz. So you can see over there the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 theta waves, and there are the slow delta waves. This is the same. This is a delta wave at the fast sweep speed and the delta wave at the slow sweep speed, and you can see that it's approximately 1 delta wave per 2 seconds at about 0.5 Hertz. Another example of a delta wave which is going off scale, it's very high amplitude. So you have theta waves riding on or phase amplitude coupled with delta waves, and you've actually even got some suppression over there, so this is consistent with deep anesthesia. The spectral edge frequency isn't displayed, but it's likely to be about 8 Hertz, given that our spindles are theta spindles. So based on this, I would consider decreasing anesthetic concentration. How about this example? Is anesthesia adequate, just right, or too deep? So I wanted to point out that our scale here is 100 microvolts, so it looks like we could decrease that scale a bit. The BIS is reading low. We've got some suppression over there, which looks like what we have over here. This is probably ECG artifact in the EEG. The EMG is low. The spectral edge frequency is reading 11. Once you start to get suppression the spectral edge frequency becomes misleading because it's not corrected for suppression. So let's look here. I'm going to point out to you the ECG artifact. So the sweep speed here is half that of this. So this is going at double the speed. So if you look at the distance between two QRS complexes, that's the same as the distance between this and that, supportive of this being ECG artifact. So looking at that in more detail, you've got a period here of roughly 4 seconds. You can see EEG suppression. There's probably EEG suppression there as well, and a period of EEG suppression there. There is ECG and other artifact. This other artifact is this fuzzy baseline, which is some sort of high frequency activity, maybe electrical interference from some device. That's a period of suppression. And here the burst, before the suppression and maybe after a suppression that occurred before, it looks like delta spindle activity. Here is nice spindle waves, and you can, I think, see these underlying delta waves there as well. So it would be helpful to consider decreasing the scale and maybe also turning on filters just to try to get a clearer idea of the waves, and then the filters could be turned off again. Taking all of the information into account, this is almost consistent. This is consistent with deep anesthesia. Okay, how about this one? Let's move more quickly now. So I'm not going to count. We've got spindles at 12 Hertz. We've got delta waves at less than 1 Hertz. So that's consistent with adequate general anesthesia. Remember, you can stop the video at any time to look yourself. This is an example similar to the one I showed previously, what artifact is present. And there you can see the ECG artifact in the EEG. Okay, so based on the available information here, we're at 1.1 Mach. Is anesthesia too deep, adequate, or insufficient? So now I'm going to use a magnifying glass and blow up that section of the EEG, which helps us to count the spindles. So now you can actually count them very precisely. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So 15 Hertz, which is consistent with our spectral edge of 16. We're at this high Mach value. Our BIS is 65. So we've got beta sigma spindles at 15 Hertz. And we've got some slow delta waves. So this is the same EEG that I showed you earlier, but now I blew up a segment with a magnifying glass, and anesthesia is adequate or on the lighter side. And then at 1.3 Mach, again, the same image that I showed before, but now I'm going to blow up again with the magnifying glass. And now when I blow up with the magnifying glass, again, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 Hertz, consistent with the spectral edge of 12.3 and a BIS of 41. So now we can see these delta waves that are more obvious, and this is anesthesia adequate or maybe even slightly on the deeper side, but not necessarily based on the EEG criteria. How about this example? You had a recent propofol induction. So with the recent propofol induction, that's why you have these really big delta waves. This is consistent with propofol induction. You get high amplitude delta waves, and this is at 200 microvolts. So the scale is 200 microvolts, and yet you can still see these huge, big delta waves, very impressive delta waves. The spindles here are more prominent on the crests of the delta waves. So we've got cross-frequency phase amplitude coupling, where the spindles are more prominent on the crests of the delta waves. You can see that here, you can see that there. And what's striking about the EEG power, as I alluded, is that it's high power over there. The amplitude is impressive. There are very big delta waves. and then the spindles are at 10 to 12 hertz. So if you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 hertz. So this is 11 hertz over there. So consistent with the spectral edge frequency, which is 12.2. The BIS value is 29, which is on the low side, and that's maybe we've come out of burst suppression and there's some lag on the BIS. That wouldn't be surprising after propofol induction. And the scale, as I said, is high, reflecting this high delta power. That's an example of a very big delta wave, and they're examples of the spindles, which are more prominent on the crests rather than the troughs of those very big delta waves. So now the same patient moves into anesthetic maintenance, and what EEG features are present, so no longer an effect from propofol, just the effect, more of the effect from the volatile anesthetic agent, probably some opioids as well. We're at 1 Mach, the BIS is 42. So is anesthesia appropriate? Is it too deep, too light? What do we think? So again, we have persistent alpha spindles at about 10 to 11 hertz. There are large delta waves at greater than half a hertz. Here's an example of a large delta wave. Again, I think you can see that the spindles are more prominent on the crest than the trough of the delta wave. The scale is still high at 200 microvolts, so we still have fairly high amplitude, maybe not quite as high as in the previous example. And anesthesia is likely either too deep or just right. We could try decreasing it, especially since we're at 1 Mach. All right, how about this example? Now we're at 0.7 Mach and the BIS is 40. And what features do we see? Well, here we have spindles again at 10 to 11 hertz if you count them. You've also got these delta waves that you can see at greater than half a hertz. We still have the scale at 200 microvolts, so relatively high power of this EEG. So anesthesia could still be too deep or just right. It's more reassuring that our age-adjusted Mach is more consistent with what we might expect. Now, late in maintenance, this is the same patient and we're going sequentially over time. And now we're late in maintenance and maybe even moving towards the end of the case. And here we're down to 0.4 Mach, so probably turning off. The BIS has gone up to 65, agent is being turned off. The spectral edge frequencies reading 22 hertz. Is that consistent with what we're seeing? Now actually, if you look at that, you could count here. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So looking at the frequency of the waves, it's certainly consistent with our spectral edge frequency over there. And our volatile anesthetic concentration is quite low. We still do have slow delta waves, but I think taking all of this information together, it looks more consistent with an emerging pattern. So the scale now notably is now down to 50 microvolts. Remember, it had been 200 microvolts in the previous examples. So the very big amplitude delta waves have gone away. We still have delta waves, but they're not quite as impressive in their amplitude. And anesthesia is likely to be light or appropriate for emergence. And then here is the same patient at 0.3 hertz with a BIS of 82. And yet, if you look at the EEG, you might say, it looks relatively flat, unimpressive. Well, the reason it looks relatively flat is we've changed the scale to an unhelpful 200 microvolts. 200 microvolts is only helpful when you have very big amplitude delta waves and they're going off scale. You've got these deflections over here, and this probably reflects muscle activity, some movements that could be causing those large deflections. Also of note is that the EMG is now up to 49 decibels, which is sort of in the range you would expect with wakefulness. So this is consistent with somebody who's moving and where wakefulness is becoming re-established. So as said, the patient is likely to be emerging. We don't have a blood pressure here, and the signal quality index is somewhat on the low side, and that could also be because this person is moving. Now it's the same patient, still at 0.3 Mach, but now we've made the scale a more helpful 50 microvolts. So now you can actually, the spectral edge frequency is still around about 20, but you can easily count the spindles here, or the frequency of these waves. It's still not high frequency beta, so this is consistent with somebody who is very groggy, sedated, unlikely to be somebody who's wide awake. So late in maintenance, nothing has changed really from the previous EEG, other than we've changed the scale, which makes it easier to interpret. And again, this is consistent with somebody who is emerging. And then here I have interpreted, that's this example, just shown and interpreted the spindle frequency, or the frequency of the beta waves is at 19 Hertz, which is consistent with our spectral edge frequency, and the patient is likely to be emerging. All right, here is an example which we've looked at previously, but let us go back again. This is a patient having a thoracotomy during anesthesia maintenance. Is anesthesia too deep, too light, or just right? So looking at the EEG more closely, you can count the spindles: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Hertz, and a very lovely pattern of slow delta waves. So the spindles are phase amplitude coupled with the delta waves. The scale is at 100 microvolts, so we've got relatively high power, so anesthesia is likely to be just right. Okay, how about this example? So in this example, I'm taking this, we've got a patient who's hemodynamically stable, slow heart rate, with a high BIS at 1.35% sevoflurane. So here you can see the scales at 100 microvolts. Our alpha spindles are at 10 Hertz. The spectral edge frequency is missing, but is at about probably 11. And the BIS is high, probably because of EMG activity. Here you can see these nice slow delta waves at less than 1 Hertz, and the interpretation of the high BIS because of the spurious high EMG activity. If you take all of the data together, we've probably got an appropriate depth of anesthesia at 0.6 Mach. How about this example? Again, hemodynamically stable, relatively slow heart rate. And essentially, the data here are very similar to in the previous slide, but now the BIS is reading 33 and the EMG is reading 27. We're at 0.7 Mach, we were at 0.6 before. Sevoflurane is pretty similar. So again, we've got alpha spindles at 10 Hertz, we've got those slow delta waves, but now the BIS is reading low for no obvious reason. I would say that in the previous example, the BIS was reading high because of the EMG, or also for no good reason. And here the BIS is reading slightly on the low side for no apparently good reason. And I would say, taking these data together, also consistent with adequate general anesthesia, I wouldn't necessarily suggest going down on the anesthetic concentration. So I've just counterposed those two examples so that you can actually see that the raw EEG, both in terms of the faster sweep speed and the slower sweep speed, look very similar in these two examples, and the only thing that's really different between these two is the BIS value and the EMG. So that's what accounts for the differences between these two. Okay, let's look at this example. Based on this information, would you say anesthesia is too deep, adequate, or insufficient? There are our spindles, and they are at 15 Hertz, so we have sigma spindles, consistent with our spectral edge frequency of 18 Hertz. We have these nice slow delta waves. You can see that we're cross-frequency, phase amplitude coupled between the spindles and the delta waves. They're less than 1 Hertz. So the spectral edge seems high, but not overly so. I'd be a little bit concerned with the BIS of 65 and the sigma spindles and the high spectral edge frequency, and I would be tempted to increase the anesthetic concentration a little bit, although the hemodynamics are not impressive, although hemodynamics are not very good indicators of depth of anesthesia. Another thing I might do is just to keep an eye and see how this patient goes, because certainly we do have sigma spindles which are consistent with unconsciousness, especially when phase amplitude coupled with these beautiful slow delta waves. So adequate general anesthesia, but might be on the light side, so we're keeping a close eye on this. Here we're at 0.8 Mach. I think now you're starting to recognize things very quickly. You can see the spindles, you can see the delta waves. Counting the spindles and counting the delta waves there, you can see that I've actually done the whole, there are lovely delta waves. You can count them all the way across. So we've got 16 delta waves in 32 seconds, which is half a Hertz, and the spindles are at 10 Hertz, entirely consistent with adequate general anesthesia. Also, the spectral edge is 11.6, which is in keeping with the alpha spindle count that we counted manually. And you can also see I try to outline the slow delta waves over there, which are this undulating shift in the baseline when we're looking at the faster sweep speed. So collectively, these data are supportive of appropriate general anesthesia. All of the values here are concordant, which is encouraging, because often I find that my interpretations are discordant with the BIS, and the alpha waves are cross-frequently coupled with slow delta waves. Here is an example of high-frequency artifact. If you look, you can see this high-frequency artifact. That could be electrical interference. It could be a bit of poor contact with an electrode. So it is not the nice, smooth EEG trace that we would like to see. We're at 50 microvolts. So based on this information, what would you say about anesthesia? So there you've got the spindles at 9 Hertz and delta wave at about half a Hertz, and the artifact to which I was referring. It's consistent with relatively deep anesthesia, but the fuzzy baseline is probably artifact. So if consistent with our clinical context, we might consider decreasing our volatile anesthetic administration, but this must take into account what else is going on clinically, what the hemodynamics are, etc. Although I don't like treating hemodynamics with anesthetic agents. All right, let's move faster now and get through some quick fire questions. And in the following, we're just quickly going to say, based on the EEG, is anesthesia likely to be too deep, adequate, or insufficient? So if we have a look at this one, you can see these slow delta waves. You can see the spindles at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Hertz. There's our spectral edge. This is consistent to me with relatively deep anesthesia. So adequate or deep would consider lightening. This is 49. Don't know what to make of that, but based on the EEG, this is adequate or deep. Okay, so here's another example. The BIS is 56. Our spectral edge is 12. But let's have a look at that and see what we think. Well, very impressive slow delta wave activity seen at the slowest sweep speed. We can see spindles, phase amplitude coupled with the delta waves, seen nicely over there. If we try to count the spindles, it's not necessarily an epoch where it's very easy to count, but we could try 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe about 10 hertz, and that's possibly true because our spectral edge frequency is 12. So I would say that's adequate or slightly deep, but possibly adequate general anesthesia. Okay, how about this one? The BIS is 41, spectral edge is 12. Again, you can see these lovely slow delta waves. You can see spindles more on the crest than the trough of the delta waves, so cross-frequency phase amplitude coupling, and counting the spindles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 hertz. So 11 hertz, which is consistent with our spectral edge frequency, adequate to deep general anesthesia. Perfect. All right, now let's have a look at this one. Well, this one is very easy because as soon as you see suppression, you know this is too deep. And the spectral edge of 17 is misleading because the algorithm here doesn't take into account suppression, so it gives you wrong or misleading spectral edge frequency values. It just looks at the periods of burst and not the suppression. And you can see even there it's showing us suppression of 9, so deep, too deep. And the BIS is 27, which is concordant, so there's concordance between the BIS and our clinical impression. How about this example? This example is a tricky one. We're at 100 microvolts, so we should probably decrease the scale to 50 microvolts to help us see what's going on more clearly. We can count the spindles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we've got 11 hertz there on our spindles. Spectral edge frequency is 15, which is higher than I would have expected from the spindle count. A bit concerning is that I'm not really seeing an underlying slow delta pattern. So although I am seeing spindles at an appropriate frequency, I'm not reassured by the delta pattern. I'd like to see if my filters are on, because maybe if you turn the filters off, you'll see a more obvious delta pattern. The BIS is reading 60, so taking that into consideration, depending on the volatile anesthetic concentration, I think I would consider deepening anesthesia, especially in view of the absence of the delta waves. But remember to check that the filters are off. So too light or adequate, but definitely concerns about too light. Here's an example of, this is at 100 microvolts. There's either a lot of artifact here or very high frequency activity. And then these are probably blinks, these high amplitude deflections going off scale. You can see more of them over here. So this is probably a person who is awake, high frequency beta activity, at least approaching 30 hertz. The spectral edge frequency is discordant. That's not true. I'm sure that the spectral edge should be reading in the 20s. The EMG is high in 48 decibels, again suggesting muscle activity, and the BIS is reading 85, which is concordant with the impression we had from looking at the EEG and the blink artifacts, whereas I mentioned this is an awake person. This one is an interesting one. So here I can see hardly any spindle activity. The BIS is 69, but the spectral edge is 6. Low EMG, what's going on here? So the spectral edge frequency is low because all we have is this very large theta or delta activity. Looks like delta activity to me. I see very little else. So this patient has a lot of delta waves. It could be a paradoxical delta arousal, but probably consistent with adequate or too deep general anesthesia. Here is an example again. I just look at that. One concern is that it's at 100 microvolts. I'd like to go down to 60, but this looks like a period of burst and then maybe some suppression. But these could be slow delta waves. So I think one of the things to do is to decrease the scale to disambiguate whether this is a slow delta pattern with something else going on over there, or if this is really burst suppression. The suppression ratio is 32, suggesting that indeed this is suppression. And the BIS is then reading falsely high at 35. If this is indeed a lot of burst suppression, I would expect the BIS to be single digits perhaps. So we want to ensure that the scale is good and check that the filters are off to ensure that we're not missing anything. But if we're not, this is probably too deep general anesthesia. Here's another example. Again, I would like to decrease the scale, but this looks like suppression in each of these sweep speeds. We have a suppression ratio of 94. I'm sure the BIS should be reading very low over here. This is too deep, and indeed the BIS is reading 2, and we should ensure that the filters are off and that the scale is at 50 microvolts. How about this one? Here we have four waves, one channel at 4 sweep speeds. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 hertz, slow delta waves, theta or alpha waves, high power, we're at 100 microvolts on our scale, so this is adequate probably, or too deep general anesthesia. The BIS is reading 33, so too deep or adequate as we had interpreted. How about this example? Well, this example you can see these beautiful big delta waves, cross-frequency coupling spindles more on the crest of the delta waves, so phase amplitude coupled, and these delta waves are at approximately 1 hertz over there, 1 per second, and the BIS is reading 57, but there's no sense I get that this is inadequate general anesthesia, especially with the spindles being at the crests and beautiful delta waves, and the spectral edge frequency at 9. So I think we have some discordance here. There's no need to deepen general anesthesia. If anything, we might consider lightening general anesthesia. So too deep or adequate. I would agree with that. And then looking at this example, we have 4 waves, single channel at 4 sweep speeds. The spectral edge frequency is 15. The BIS is 66. The EMG is low. Let's see if we can find an easy one to count. Here we can see these delta waves over there, delta waves over there. So we've got delta waves, spindles, not easy to count. So given that I'm not counting the spindles very easily, depending on the clinical context, I'd wonder if this was a little bit light. So adequate or light depends on the clinical context. Maybe try to get better EEG example that's easier to interpret. Here again, an example of the BIS saying 59, but clearly we've got EEG suppression over here. We should decrease the scale, but this is likely to be too deep and the BIS is misleading. So light anesthesia there. In this example, we've got, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 hertz, spectral edge of 9, BIS of 42, these are all congruent. You've got these beautiful slow delta waves. This is probably too deep, could lighten anesthesia. And here is an example of a BIS of 56. Our spectral edge is 12, and you can see these lovely slow delta waves, spindles, persistent spindles. Remember, persistent spindles more consistent with general anesthesia than with sleep. I can look for a good place to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe 10 hertz over there. So consistent with the spectral edge of 12 hertz. I do not think that this is consistent with light general anesthesia, despite this relatively robust blood pressure. I think anesthesia, by all intents, is either adequate or deep based on the EEG criteria. So adequate is a reasonable assessment. In this example, again, you can see the slow delta waves, lovely pattern of spindles here, more prominent on the crest than on the trough. You see that here too. The spectral edge is again about 12, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hertz again. So this is actually a very similar looking EEG to this previous one. However, here the BIS was reading 56 and here the BIS is reading 41. Very little has changed in terms of the anesthesia, but the BIS number has changed considerably with no good explanation. So again, adequate general anesthesia. So a few final vignettes, not specifically related to clinical decision making, but I thought these are nice examples just to show, to conclude. So what happened over here? Has the EEG suddenly transitioned from a lovely delta spindle pattern, you can see these spindles, delta waves, to persistent suppression, these flat EEGs? And the answer is no, because our scale has been changed to 1,000 microvolts. And at that scale, we're not going to see any features of the EEG. And some of the clue to that is you can actually see that we should be seeing delta waves, theta waves, and yet we're seeing none of it. We're just seeing a flat line. So an inappropriate scale can make it very difficult for us to interpret the EEG. Here is an example of, sorry, I wanted to go back just to show you. Here is an example of, this is with the Philips EEG module, how you can set the scale all the way from 20 microvolts going up to 1,000 microvolts. And typical scales are in these sort of ranges, but sometimes we go higher. Almost never do we use these high scales unless we're looking for very high amplitude. For example, seizure activity can be very high amplitude, but it's really important to check the scale. Here is an example of setting the filters. So the low filter, either to turn off or to use a low setting, like 0.5 hertz, so that the useful low frequency delta waves are not filtered out or attenuated. And then the high frequency filter, this is on the Philips EEG module, goes from 15 to 50 hertz. Usually I use the 50 or 30 hertz. The problem with 15 hertz is that you might filter out useful beta activity above 15 hertz. Remember, these are not, they're not abrupt filters, so even at 15 hertz you would still have some frequencies above 15 hertz coming through, but they exponentially decrease above the filter threshold. This is an example of the impedance limit for the electrodes. You can choose what impedance limit is acceptable and will be viewed as passed by the EEG. 20 kilo ohms is relatively high. I usually set my impedance limit at 10 kilo ohms or lower. This can be done with some EEG systems, not typically with the BIS, but again, this is with the EEG from the Philips module itself. So here is an example of the scale being inappropriately high, 1,000 microvolts, so we can't actually see the waveforms, but we can see over there through the Fourier analysis what the composition is of these waves, and we can also see the trends. This is the spectral edge frequency over time. Now we've moved to a more appropriate 30 microvolt scale. This is the same patient, and now you can see at different sweep speeds the beautiful slow delta waves, the spindles that are cross-frequency phase amplitude coupled, and you can see that we have a predominantly delta theta pattern with very little alpha and beta activity, and that's consistent with this three-dimensional time graph. So this is time going backwards, so that's time, and here's frequency. This is 10 hertz, 20 hertz, and 30 hertz. So we've got virtually no activity, no over time. Every one of these I think is 2 seconds going backwards. So we have some blips over here in the beta range, but most recently or most commonly we have all of our frequencies are below 10 hertz. We've got the median frequency, which is the red one, and the mode frequency, which is this light blue one, is in the delta range over here, and even the median frequency is in the delta range. So consistent with the Fourier analysis. And then here's an example. This is a patient who has both the Philips EEG and a BIS, and the BIS is reading 73, and there could be some EMG artifact that's driving that, because we can see that we've got some beautiful delta waves with spindles, and on the faster sweep speed, actually we've only got apparently theta waves and delta waves. You can see that that's EEG2, it's 95% delta and some theta, so very little alpha or beta activity. You can see that as well over here, the spectral edge frequency way over to the left hand side of the frequencies, and the peak and the median frequency are in the low delta range as well. So this looks like ECG artifact in the BIS, so that and the EMG might be confusing it and telling us that the BIS is 73, although the signal quality index of 100, this is clearly nonsense, and the BIS is not 73, and the BIS, as it often does, is misleading us. Here is an example of impedances, and they're all appropriate, but the impedance limit is 20 kilo ohms, which is relatively generous. If you look, this one is 11 kilo ohms, so not too bad, but starting to be a bit on the high side. These are the right-sided electrodes, these are the left-sided electrodes from frontal pole 1 to temporal 3, and then from temporal 4 to frontal pole 2. This is again another example showing you BIS and concurrent EEG. I don't think that it shows much more than the last example. So I'll leave it at that for now. I have been bending your ear for a long time. Thank you for watching these clinical decision examples, and hopefully that's helped you with some finesse in relation to EEG interpretation and clinical decision making.